So hello and welcome to our 10th episode of Ignite. I feel like we should have a cake to celebrate almost, getting to number 10.
Reached the decade.
Yeah, we've done a decade of Ignites. But thank you to everyone for joining. Thanks to all of the repeat listeners and viewers who come along, and to anybody that's joining us for the first time. If it is your first one, very simply, this is a series of webinars, very short, very snappy, designed to discuss some of the issues and challenges in the marketing, strategy and insights world. So last week we welcomed the former head of Insight for Waitrose, Claire Goff, onto Ignite. And she gave an incredibly interesting talk all about the future of retail and what things might look like for retail post-lockdown. If you've got any interest at all in retail trends, I suggest take a look at that. You can find that on our LinkedIn and in our YouTube channel. I'll put the links to those in the chat channel shortly. This week, we're welcoming Forge co-founder Karl Miley to the webinar. Karl's going to be talking to us about demand spaces. They've been the new shiny thing in the world of segmentation for a few years now, and I'm sure many of you will have versions of your own. When created and deployed in the right way, they can be incredibly powerful tools, though unfortunately, they're not always done as well as they can be. So Karl's going to show us some best practice tips for developing and deploying them effectively, and show us how to avoid some of the common mistakes and pitfalls. So if you have any questions at all, please post them in the chat and we will pick them up post them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end of the talk. Just the flow of this talk means it's better to do them at the end. But anyway, that's enough from me. Over to you, Karl. Welcome, Karl.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us to talk all things demand spaces. As Adam mentioned, over the last few years, demand spaces have very much become the new shiny thing in the world of segmentation, and everyone seems to be talking about them, which is no doubt why you've joined us today. And there are a very good number of very good reasons why people are talking about them. They're consumer derived, so they're based upon analysis of real consumer behaviour. They help us understand how a category operates, what are the key dynamics that are at play, and what's influencing the choices that consumers are making. And three, depending on who's created them for you, they can be linked directly to rich continuous data sources, so they give us an ongoing picture, a dynamic picture of our landscape. Now, of course, those all sound like the benefits of many different segmentation approaches, particularly points 1 and 3, and you're certainly not wrong. But I guess this new demand space approach is an evolution of the established 6Ws model that we've all come to know and love. With the old 6Ws, we used to interrogate each W separately, and we looked for the opportunities to be found within each W individually. So we looked for opportunities in the who, then opportunities in the why, opportunities in the when and where, etc. But as I'm sure you know, as consumers, we're not as simple as that. You know, the decisions that we make on each and every occasion are made up of a combination of all of these factors: who you are, your attitudes and your values, the needs you have, functional and emotional, and the context in which you find yourself. So where you are, who you're with, what time of day it is, etc., etc. And it's this combination of all of these factors that shapes your decisions and your choices. And so really, any opportunities that we identify should really reflect this dynamic too. So rather than looking at each W in turn to identify the opportunities, demand spaces look to highlight opportunities differently. The first thing they do is they focus in on what drives consumer choice and behaviour in the category. In other words, I look to identify and showcase what are the key Ws, be that who, the why, the when, where, etc. They then look to combine these key Ws into a simple framework, one that allows us to look at the intersections of these key Ws in order to identify those opportunities, hopefully fewer, bigger, better opportunities for growth. They effectively identify our demand spaces. And so this framework, if it's set up well, it should also provide all of the rules on how to win in each of these different demand spaces as well. So I guess in theory, this sounds like a significant evolution of the 6Ws and an ever stronger strategic tool. But if demand spaces are so useful in helping understand a category and providing clarity on the opportunities that exist, it's been really interesting for us to see that so many of our clients are actually finding that their demand spaces simply aren't working for them, and in some instances are actually limiting their growth ambition. So I guess what I'd like to do today in this short session is simply top line a couple of the issues that we see relatively often, such that wherever you are on your demand space journey, whether you have an existing model, whether it's something you're about to embark on, or whether you're looking to refresh and optimize that. Hopefully you can take note of these and look to avoid them wherever possible. So of all of the demand space frameworks that we've had shared with us across a whole host of different clients, across a whole host of different categories, I guess in our view, there are two key reasons why they're not always as helpful as they potentially could be. The first issue that we often see is linked to what demand spaces are, how they've been created and how they've been defined. And the second and probably more important issue we see is effectively how they are being used within a business. But before we go through each of these in a bit more detail, I guess it's probably sensible to start by asking ourselves, what actually is a demand space? What are they? So I guess for any category, there are millions, if not billions, of occasions around the world every day, occasions where who you are and the needs you have and the context in which you find yourself influences the decisions and the choice that you make. Now, a demand space effectively looks to simplify all of this. It looks to take all of the occasions, all of that complexity, and distill it down into a set of rich, targetable segments. In other words, for any given category, it looks to help us understand how different types of people satisfy different types of needs on different types of occasions. And from this, it helps us understand where are the viable opportunities to help us drive growth. But I guess what is really key to appreciate is that it's the combination and importance of those W's, and that varies by category. So it's absolutely critical that your demand space framework is defined based upon how consumers make choices in your category. And I guess it's this point that links us to our first watch out. Where we've seen examples of, I guess, supposed demand space frameworks working less well is it's when this point hasn't been fully embraced. You know, we've seen examples of situations where clients have taken all their W's and there's just a desire to reduce all of that down onto a single axis. So it basically means that they have removed one of the key drivers of behavior. They've effectively ignored one of the key W's. We've also seen other scenarios where clients have taken a view that it's just a single W that drives their market. And so they've only used that as their lens to define their demand spaces. Now, based on everything that I've said previously, in both of these cases, because we are missing a key W, a key factor that influences demand, what typically happens is neither of these solutions are able to explain real consumer behavior well enough. Effectively, they become quite blunt tools. And so often what we have seen is that many of our clients have looked to just dig and dig and dig and become increasingly granular with their demand spaces themselves in order to compensate for that lack of understanding. And as a result, we've seen clients end up with a demand space model which has 12, 13, 14, 15 plus different demands, which, yes, they might be statistically true, but a model with that many different demand spaces is not useful simplification. It's an incredibly difficult tool to try and embed within a business and get people to understand. And often when you create a model with that number of different demand spaces, what it ends up happening is you end up defining tiny opportunity areas. And it means you run the risk of micro-targeting your brands. And of course, whilst no one can deny that focus is absolutely key for brands, micro-targeting certainly isn't something that you want to be doing. So what should we do? Well, hopefully it's obvious by now. To get maximum value from your framework, it means that you need to ensure that you are creating demand spaces that realistically reflect what drives consumer behavior in your category, and that you allow the key axes and the key W's all to be present on your framework such that you get that richness of understanding and you can understand the different dynamics between those W's and how they interact in people's choices and behavior. Now, yes, I'm probably stating the obvious. I'm probably starting to begin to sound like a broken record, but it's been really surprising to us just how often this relatively basic principle has been overlooked in some of the models that we have seen being defined as demand spaces. Another key consideration for us when developing a demand space framework is not only just to look to reflect where the volume is, but also look where the value is too. Again, something that's often overlooked in many of the solutions we've seen. Now, any analytics team worth their money will always steer you away from models where an individual demand space is either too large or too small. But all too often, that recommendation is based upon only looking at the size of a demand through just one dimension, and that is share of occasions. This is absolutely a key criteria, and it's obviously something that we typically tend to measure as part of our study. But we believe at the Forge it's also critical to look at any potential solutions through a financial lens too. As often you will find that those smaller demands in terms of share of occasions that you might typically ignore if you were to just look at that as a dimension are actually ones where trade up and premiumization can often play a key role. And so whilst they may be small from a share of occasions point of view, they can end up being much larger commercial opportunities for us to target. So for us, it's really important that when you are looking to define your demand space model, it's important to look through both a share of occasions, volume perspective, and also a value one too. Now, that all being said, I guess our biggest frustration with demand space is not what they are or how they've been created or defined, but in fact, how they're being used. In a bid to create portfolio clarity, we're too often seeing a focus on brands being assigned to a single demand space. You know, brands are being forced to only innovate or only communicate against just one small slice of the opportunity. And very often this is in conflict with the business saying that it wants to behave entrepreneurially. No entrepreneur in their right mind would limit their potential growth because it didn't adhere to the demand space at which it's being defined. But interestingly, when we've seen clients working with their models, we've seen examples of exactly this. Now, that all being said, if your growth opportunity is one about driving frequency, then absolutely a single-minded, single demand space focus is an incredibly helpful thing to have. But if you as a business owner, your growth opportunity is one about driving penetration, and for many FMCG categories it frequently is, then that single-minded, single demand space focus doesn't illuminate growth. In fact, it probably handcuffs it instead. Why? Well, because it doesn't really allow us to look through adjacent demand spaces through the window of different audiences. In other words, it stops us finding new ways to expand our brand footprint and engage more users and drive penetration. Now, often at the Forge, our brief is to also help clients look for innovation opportunities with scale. But again, these don't just exist in a small box. I guess this hyper focus on occupying a single demand space is absolutely killing innovation. Great brands, as I'm sure you're all aware, have this ability to stretch across occasions and stretch across people. And they can do all of this without the need for complicated sub-brands. And I think Mars is probably a really good illustration and a great example of this, as they take their brands, for example, in this case, Maltesers, across multiple different demand spaces through format and product innovation. And yet, it's not at all unusual for us to see other businesses choose often the costly and resource intensive option of trying to sustain multiple brands to tackle a single opportunity. Why? Because their demand space dictates that that's the only way that they can do it. Every brand has to have a home, and that is rigidly enforced. So in our view, while segmentation and demand spaces should absolutely help to aid prioritization, it should give you real clarity about where to play and how to win. We need to get much more comfortable using them as flexible frameworks. Brands need focus, absolutely. Portfolios need distinction, absolutely. But if we start by putting our demand spaces front and center in all of our brand decision making, we'll continue to find it hard to consider broader growth opportunities. So in essence, we need to use our demand spaces as a flexible guiding tool, a cross-reference to ensure that all of the decisions that we are making will ultimately help us achieve our brand ambitions. Demand spaces shouldn't be a tool that shortcuts brand decision making. They should be a tool to help us illuminate considered choices about where to play and how to win. So whistle-stop tour of demand spaces, but just for us in conclusion, to give you a couple of key things just to bear in mind wherever you are on your demand space journey. Please, whenever you're developing it, ensure that your demand space framework is based upon what drives consumer choice and behaviour in your category. be really wary of over and under segmenting your model and making it blunt. Try and keep it as sharp as possible. Only sort of create demand spaces where there is a meaningful difference and a warranted difference and inclusion in your model. Look for the money. Don't just choose solutions based on volume. Ensure that you've kind of got that commercial angle, an opportunity to look at them through as well. And please use your demand space model as a flexible framework to aid decision making rather than an absolute must do. Thank you very much. I wonder if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, Karl, there is one question here. Thanks for that, by the way. Really interesting. The question here is from Rosa. It starts off with a statement, actually. I'm just going to read it out to you. Hey, Karl, I'm guessing the answer to this is no, as you did a great piece of work for us on bringing some of our existing data sources together, but assume you don't always need to do fresh research in order to create demand spaces.
Hello, Rosa. I think that's a really good question. I think it's one of those interesting things. I think whenever the word segmentation or demand spaces or anything sort of comes to the fore, I think the first thing that people immediately think are pound signs or a long protracted project. And clearly, if you're developing a model or optimizing a model, then creating something bespoke that really caters to your category and the challenges that you are specifically facing is probably the best way to do it. But it's not absolutely the only way. You know, for us, for clients, we have taken their existing information and recut it. We've refreshed it using other data sources in a very efficient way to provide a fresh perspective. We've also developed hypothetical frameworks for our clients as well. So there is absolutely a way of developing demand space frameworks irrespective of what budget is available to you. And it doesn't, like you say, always need to have fresh research at its very heart.
Great, thanks, Karl. I've got another question here as well that's coming privately. The question is, obviously a lot of the demand space work that would have been done over the last year or 2, 3 years ago, maybe looking fairly out of date now with what's going on with COVID. You know, how often do you need to refresh these things? Can you refresh them, you know, when new behaviors come to light? Like how fluid do they need to be?
Again, another really good question. I think it's very much dependent upon the category. I mean, some categories certainly evolve at faster rates than others, and I think that needs to be something that influences how regularly you need to revisit and refresh these. I think COVID right now is an interesting situation that we find ourselves in. We've got a number of clients that are coming to us and going and asking exactly the same question. And I think our answer to them in the vast majority of situations is that the demand space model that they have absolutely holds. But I think given the different stages that we are finding ourselves from being in lockdown through to social restrictions easing through to potentially what the new normal is, I think there is every value in having a look at those demand spaces again to understand which of those are more likely to increase in relevance and incidence and which ones are potentially going to decline. You know, to give you an example, if you look at something like the world of personal care, I think what's been quite interesting to see is the behaviours that people have been adopting whilst in lockdown in terms of, you know, the frequency with which we are, you know, encountering other people face to face, means that I think for some people, maybe their personal care regimes may have gone a little bit on the back burner or might have been streamlined somewhat. And I think that's certainly playing out in, you know, the category performance that we're seeing for some of our clients. But that's probably just a short-term thing. As we move out, you know, social restrictions start to get reduced and we start to move on, then absolutely, I think things will probably get back to normal. But again, in terms of refreshing, it's wholly dependent, I think, on your category and how it, you know, how much that evolves.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Karl. I think that might be time. If anyone does have any more questions, ping them over in the chat whilst we wrap up. But yeah, thanks again, Karl, for that. Very, very interesting. If anyone, I think a couple of people might have joined halfway through. The full talk will be going live on our social channels tomorrow. So if you keep an eye on our LinkedIn and YouTube channel, both of those links are in the chat feed there. Other than that, next week, we've got another special guest coming on the show. So we've got Lawrence Lamb, who's the director and partner of Nuance Tree. They're a market research agency based out in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Lawrence specializes in cross-region studies. his insight into Chinese consumers' behavior and social development helped global clients adapt their brands for China with strong and clear cultural relevance. So what Lawrence is going to share is some opportunities and trends that he sees going on in China, things that could be relevant for Western brands, things that could be relevant for us as we look at China as a market. So join us for that next week, same time on Thursday at 3 o'clock. The invites will be going out to that on our social channels tomorrow and on Monday. So do keep an eye out for those. But other than that, thanks again for everyone that joined. Thanks to anyone that was new to the show. We're very, very grateful for you taking the time to join us, and there's plenty more content coming in the future. So thanks everybody. Thanks, Karl.
Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.